If we go back to our browser and back to the session section, and on the right hand side, if we select session destroy, and we've got destroys all data registered to a session. If we scroll down, you've got session destroy, destroys all of the data associated with the current session. It does not unset any of the global variables associated with the session or unset the cookie, the session cookie. To use the session variables again, session start has to be called. As you can see, it doesn't unset session cookie. This is why it's been recreated again. In order to kill the session altogether, like to log out the user, because login usually is where our sessions are pretty commonly used. The session ID must also be unset. If a cookie is used to propagate the session ID, default behavior, which is what we're using, then the session cookie must be deleted. Set cookie, as you may remember from a previous video, may be used for that. And that's exactly what we are going to do. So if we go back to our editor, now after session start, what we are going to do is set cookie. And in order to get the name of the existing session, as you may remember, we're using a session name to set and to get the name of the session. So we just use this one without any argument this time. Then comma, null as a second argument because we're not setting the session to anything. And then we are going to use time. Again, to remove the session, as you may remember, we need to use the negative, the past time, so minus 3600 seconds, which is basically 1 hour. So current time minus 1 hour. So if we use this and then we use session destroy, and if we save all that, we don't have to worry about these sessions here. If we save all that, go back to our browser, refresh it, still displays the number, but if we go back to our editor, you can see our session now is gone. If we now remove this, save the file, and go back to our browser, refresh the page, go back to the editor, you can see the new file with the new session ID has been created. We can open this file now, and you can see the same values obviously have been saved to it. But now we have the session ID generated dynamically, which is the default behavior. Now, another thing worth mentioning is when we are setting the session variable, which is basically the index of the session superglobal, the name follows the same structure as when we are actually creating the standard variable, which means it cannot start with a number and it cannot be just a number. So if we try, let's say, set it to 0, this timestamp, and if we preview it in a browser, refresh, there we go, we get the notice, obviously skipping numeric key 0. Then we go back to our editor. We can, however, use the 0 at the end of the string or after the first letter. Let's say timestamp 0 equals time, and if we go back to the browser, refresh it, everything's fine. So just remember, obviously, it follows the same basically rules when it comes to the naming of the specific session variable. Now, another thing, how do we unset, how do we remove specific indexes from the session variables, in other words? If I now remove this echo here and we are going to uncomment this printing R of the session, if we preview everything in the browser, you can see this timestamp 0 has been saved, obviously, and it's stored within this file, as well as the timestamp which we are setting up on every page request. How do we unset it? So basically remove it, and I've already used the keyword, obviously. What we're doing is the same way as with all the other ones, using simply unset function, which is obviously used with all the arrays and so on. So session, and we want to remove timestamp 0, for instance. If we save it, preview everything in the browser, refresh, and there we go, our timestamp 0 is now removed. Obviously, this timestamp changes all the time whenever we refresh the page, because every time the page is loaded, we are redefining these values, obviously by calling these 5 lines here. So they are basically refreshed, in other words. So as you can see, that's all these values, obviously because they are the same. Strings, SSD tutorials, name and year, and active is still the same. It's the only different one, the only dynamically generated one is the timestamp, obviously, which is why we see the difference. So now we've obviously removed a single session variable. Another interesting thing about a session destroy is that if we use session destroy, let's say after defining, let's actually create this block here, and I'm going to duplicate all this, use session destroy, and then we see if after destroying the session we still get any data after this. If we go back to the browser, refresh, and there we go, it still stays here. As you can see, even though we called session destroy, this has been basically passed to the block after this session destroy. And this is because the session here reads the file, we've set the session, we've used this session which we've set here, we call this session destroy, which, as you can see, removed the file and obviously removed our session, but we still have access to this session's super global, which stores all this data until the next page load. Pretty much the same way as with the cookies, you may remember. The file is read, and as long as the file basically is not reloaded, the page is not reloaded, the values initially fetched from the file are available throughout the script. But if I now try, and I'm just going to comment all this, and I'm going to keep this these bits at the top, and I'm going to just, so obviously we started the session and we want to just see what's inside of this session. If I now refresh the page, is an empty array. As you can see, second time that I've reloaded the page, obviously our session is now empty. As you can see, obviously our session file has been recreated because, again, we haven't removed the cookie. Let's now uncomment the whole block and remove everything from the session destroy down to the bottom of the file, and we're going to keep it the way it is. Now I'm going to create another file in our project, call it about, and now what I'm going to do is use this top bit basically with session save path, say session name and session start, and if we just use it inside of this about.php, and then I'm going to use this echo statement here with a print r. If we save it, just to show you that actually the data which we are saving in one file is available to us in the other. So if we go back to our browser, refresh our index page, and now if we navigate to the about.php, there we go. As you can see, the same data has been fetched from the session file and is now available to us on the About Us page or any other page that we would be using, which uses the same setup, basically session path, session name and session start. If I was to comment the first two lines, now the session start would basically create a new session, but it wouldn't be saved to our sessions directory. It would generate the default, basically PHP session. If I just refresh it, as you can see, it doesn't know which, there's no basically values in this newly generated file. If I now open Firefox preferences, and if we go to individual cookies, and now if I'm just going to use course, PHP course, there you go. This is our custom session name which we've created in index.php, and then the new one with default session name and new obviously ID, which, because we've commented the first two lines, has been triggered and created obviously in this about.php file. If I now close this, and if we go back to the editor, if I uncomment these two, obviously if we just uncomment it this way and go back to our browser, it will fetch the right data, which we basically save to the session inside of the index.php. Let's now try another example. I'm going to remove all this and just use the default session as well on the index page and about.php page as well. So basically we're using just the default one. If we go back to the browser, refresh the page on the About Us, there's nothing, but if we go to index, this will basically save, if we go back to our editor, all these session variables to this default session, which is also available on the About Us page. So if we go back, we go to About Us now, and there we go. As you can see, all these values, these session variables, are available to us because obviously originally we've created this default session on the About Us page. And if we go to PHP course, and now we are using this one basically on both of the pages, basically the default session with the default name. So that's why we have access to the same session, obviously, on both of the pages. Now, before we finish this lesson, I would like to show you the journey that our session actually takes. First of all, what I'm going to do is to remove all the cookies basically for our domain. So it's PHP course, and let's remove whatever we have here. So I'm just removing that one. We can close this. Now I'm going to be using Firebug for Firefox. If you would like to follow this exercise, simply go to the add-ons in the Firefox and search for a Firebug. I won't see them if I just hit enter. It's already in my add-ons. You should see it in available add-ons tab. It's already installed, so this is the one you are after. Once you have it installed, you should see this button right here at the top. So when you click it, you'll get this panel here basically. The one we are interested in is the net, and we're going to look at the all subsection. If we go back to our editor, the first thing I want to do is to basically remove everything we have done up to now. So let's remove this sessions folder, about page, and empty our index.php. Now that we have everything done, if we go back to our page and let's just reload this page and see what we're getting. Basically, the URL, you can see it's been used with the GET request, obviously, to this domain. The status is 200, which means everything is okay. The page has loaded fine. And then you can see the set of headers. There's the request headers and we have response headers. Request headers is what browser sends to the server to request specific information. The response headers is what we get back from the server to the browser. As you can see, there is no information about any sessions or cookies. That's because we obviously haven't got anything that would instantiate any session or cookie inside of our index.php file. But let's change this. Let's go back to our editor and start the session. We're going to use the default setup, so session start. We're not going to be creating a different name or basically different ID or specifying a different path. We're just going to use everything as default. And if we go back to the save, obviously the file, back to the browser, and now if we refresh, look what's going to happen. If we open this path here, you can see that the response we got from the server gave us the header, and the headers are basically used to send some additional information with requests and responses. So the browser sends some headers basically to the server to tell obviously the server all this information they can see here in the request, and then server responds with the bunch of headers as well to tell browser basically what to do with the information and so on. So as you can see, server has responded with the set cookie header, and it gave us PHP says ID, which is the name of the session of the cookie that we want to create, and the ID of the cookie basically, which is corresponding to the session ID on the server, which obviously the PHP server has created already. So now that we've done this, we can also go to the cookies here tab, and you can see the same thing, received cookies. This is the value with this obviously name for this domain and so on. If we now go back to the headers and reload the page, now if we go back, expand this section here, you can see that response headers, we didn't get back anything from the header, from a server, but instead the request which we sent by reloading the page, the browser sent cookie header with exactly same session, basically with session ID. So we've got this PHP says ID with the corresponding ID, which has been earlier sent by the server to the browser, obviously. So now when we call this session ID, session start, if we go back to the editor, when we call this session start, this specific file, this index.php, now knows that the header sent us PHP says ID cookie with the specific ID, and because of this, it took this ID and got the information from within this session file with the same ID basically. And what it did, once this function has been processed, it basically populated our session super global. So if I just simply echo print r again, and if we use session and then echo close pre-tag, if we save it, if we refresh the page, you can see it's obviously an empty array because we haven't added any session variables to it yet. But now we've got a connection between the browser and a server. Every time the browser is going to send a request to the to our server now is going to send this cookie, because we've got this cookie for this specific domain, send it with every request. And now depends on whether the page we are requesting actually uses cookies, because if we go back to the editor and create, let's say, about us page, again, about and empty, without session start, then obviously that specific file, this specific page, is not interested in sessions at all. But even though we don't use sessions on this page, the request, which we are sending using a browser, is still going to send it just in case we might need it on this specific page, and any information that we may need to fetch from the session file on the server. But now let's go back, and let's go back to our index.php file. And what I'm going to do is just to show you what we can actually use the function called getAllHeaders to display all the headers that the browser has sent us. So if we now, I'm just going to minimize this slightly like this. And if I refresh the page, you can see this is what we got from the browser sent to the server basically with this request. And as you can see, it matches what we have here, request headers. So we've got all this information, including the cookie one here. As you can see, PHP says ID. And obviously, this is corresponding to the same record, which has been sent from the browser. So now if we go back, and another thing we can do, obviously now we can create another session, but this time let's actually use the named session. So session name, and we're going to put custom session, for instance. What's going to happen this time, if I go back to the browser, with the request, if I refresh the page, and let's have a look at what we've sent, what we received from the server. We've sent the same session as we had previously, because that was the only session that we had up to now. But the response from the server has sent us another set cookie request in the header. So it says, create another cookie called custom session with this specific ID. And now if I refresh the page, look what's going to happen. If we go back, you can see we haven't got any more requests from the server, because the browser has already created this session, this custom session. As you can see, we've got two custom cookies here at the moment. And obviously, when it sent the request, the server, the file, the index.php, when it hit, if we go back to the editor, when it hit this section here, the session start, it already knows that this session, the obviously cookie has been sent, the session with this name has already been created, and obviously the cookie exists, so we don't need to reply with another set cookie basically header, because it's already in existence. So simply read this file from the server obviously now, and make all these session variables available to us within the session super global. So that's pretty much how it works. It's basically communication between a browser and a server, which allows us to later on identify the specific session for this session actually that user is using, because obviously you may have several different users accessing the server, the same page at the same time, and they all have to be recognized in some way. And obviously these unique IDs, these cookies here, session cookies basically, allow us to do this, to identify the right session file on the server.